The Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on understanding the importance of DHS preparedness grants, perspectives from the field. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing devastation in Puerto Rico from the recent earthquakes. The island is still recovering from Hurricane Maria, and to have another large-scale disaster is heartbreaking. Our sympathies and prayers are with you. Without objection, the chair may declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Without objection, members not sitting on the subcommittee will be permitted to participate in today's hearing. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. We're here today to hear from stakeholders about their perspectives on the Department of Homeland Security's preparedness grant programs. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks revealed gaps in the nation's emergency preparedness. DHS preparedness grants were established to address gaps by helping state, local, tribal, and territorial governments enhance their ability to prepare for, respond to, recover from, and mitigate against terrorist attacks. As representative from New Jersey's 10th Congressional District, I understand the importance of these grant programs. My district contains Newark Liberty International Airport, the New Jersey Transit Authority, and the Port Authority of Newark and Elizabeth Marine Terminal. This, in addition to having dense area of industrial facilities and being in close proximity to New York City. The Newark, Jersey City area has consistently been considered one of the highest risk urban areas in the nation and has been referred to as the most dangerous 2 miles in America. Throughout my time in Congress, New Jersey's emergency preparedness has depended on financial assistance from DHS preparedness grants programs. The Urban Area Securities Initiative, commonly known as UASI, has particularly been helpful with supporting my district's ability to build and maintain important capabilities necessary to keep us safe. At the same time, the funding has helped ensure that first responders have the resources they need to do their jobs effectively and safely. America's security depends on this important federal investment, so I am disappointed in the President's regular efforts to slash preparedness grant funding. For example, President Trump's proposed over $900 million in cuts to DHS preparedness grant funding for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. The President's FY 2020 budget would have cut existing preparedness grant funding by nearly $700 million. The threat landscape is ever evolving, and a lack of preparedness funding from the federal government would make it that much more difficult for states to meet their homeland security needs. Today, America is at an elevated risk of terrorist attack following the killing of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani by U.S. forces in Iraq. And because Iraq has promised to revenge, jurisdictions like mine are on heightened alert and have to be more vigilant. We are also reminded of Homeland Security's needs by events like the Jersey City shooting at a Jewish grocery store last month that claimed the lives of 4 victims, including a police officer. The loss of one life is too many, and I can only imagine how this tragedy would have unfolded if Jersey City was not armed with the capabilities they were able to build with DHS preparedness grant funding. This instance mounted on top of nearly a dozen anti-Semitic acts that occurred in the past month in New York more than evidence the problems we have with domestic terrorism in this country and underscores the threat against religious communities. In light of this, I am proud to have supported Chairman Thompson's efforts to secure funding to protect nonprofit organizations at risk of terrorist attacks through his legislation, the Securing American Nonprofit Organizations Against Terrorism Act of 2019, which passed the House and the Senate and Congress. DHS preparedness grants have proved to be an invaluable investment in America's security, and I'm pleased that this committee has consistently supported and encouraged robust funding for these grant programs. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses on how they use DHS grant funding to secure their communities, whether any improvements can be made to these grants programs in order to enhance Homeland Security. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. King, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome all the witnesses here today. I have a prepared statement. I'll just insert that into the record. I would just like to, first of all, thank all the witnesses for being here today. And I think it's especially appropriate that these precise witnesses we have here today. John Miller, obviously from New York, with the tremendous threats we face from Hezbollah and Iran, in addition to the everyday threats we face, Mr. Miller, in view of the spate of horrible anti-Semitic attacks we've had in recent times, and Mr. Kearse, the terrible assault that took place in Jersey City. And Mr. Sprayberry, it's really interesting. My daughter just moved to Charlotte, and you moved from where my district office is located now in New York. I have to say, with Mr. Bishop here from North Carolina, that you've really managed to overcome your accent. You and I don't talk alike at all, even though my office is located where you grew up. So you certainly don't talk like me or John Miller, but well, no one talks like John Miller. But very seriously, these are serious times. And as the chairman mentioned, the Trump administration, and before that, the Obama administration, had tried to make drastic cuts in Homeland Security, in the funding. Maybe we're victims of our own success because there have not been successful attacks in the United States. Somehow, terrorism recedes to the background. The fact is that thankfully, Congress, both under the Obama administration and the Trump administration, has restored the Homeland Security funding. But to me, it just sends a bad signal when the administrations don't realize how real these threats are, how terrible these threats are, and how our world can turn upside down on a moment's notice. So I want to thank Chairman Payne for his efforts in fighting hard for the funds, as I tried to do when I was in the majority, when I was chairman. Now, again, we do live in dangerous times, and that was made more dangerous last week with the killing of Soleimani, which I supported, but even if I didn't, the fact is, as Americans, we have to defend ourselves. So, Mr. Miller, certainly during your testimony, whatever you can expand on as far as what we're doing with Hezbollah and Iranian operatives here in the country. Mr. Masters, as far as anti-Semitism, it's something which doesn't appear limited to any particular group of attackers. It's been a wide range, unfortunately, people who are focused on anti-Semitism. And Mr. Kearse, if you could really discuss what went on in Jersey City and how you feel as far as the grant funding going to nonprofits and to community centers, religious centers, what that has to be done to improve. And also, Mrs. Sprayberry representing, going beyond terrorism, the fact of natural disasters. And the fact that I know Charlotte, and my daughter reminded me of this, has been taken off the list. So again, all of these are so important today. And again, I think that when this committee was formed, the whole world was talking about Homeland Security. Because we have managed to do a very good job over the last 15, 17 years, somehow people think the problem is not there. I would say the threats are as great today as they were prior to 9/11. Thankfully, we have defenses in place, but of all the defenses we have in place, the enemy is constantly adapting. And they can afford to make mistake after mistake. We can't afford to make any mistakes. And again, with anti-Semitism, which many of us had hoped was just a creature of the past, the fact that that is now reemerging. And again, without going into a whole debate over climate change and everything else, the fact that we have seen such an increase in natural disasters, and we saw it on Long Island. Your old neighborhood was underwater with Hurricane Sandy, storms we hadn't seen in 50 years, 60 years. So in any event, it's, again, Chairman, I commend you for having these witnesses here today. Unfortunately, it's at a particularly appropriate time. more appropriate than we'd like, but the fact is that's the reality, and we're here to face reality. So thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, Ranking Member, I always appreciate your leadership in this area. I know you've been at this since the beginning, so we respect your leadership in this area. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Michael Sprayberry, the Executive Director of North Carolina Department of Public Safety Division of Emergency Management, Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Welcome. Our second witness is Mr. Greg Kearse, the Director of Jersey City's Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. I should know that. Mr. Kearse has previously appeared before our panel. Welcome back, and thank you for your continued willingness to assist this subcommittee in its oversight efforts. Our third witness is Mr. Michael Masters, the Director and CEO of Secure Community Network. And our fourth and final witness is Mr. John Miller, the Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism within the New York City Police Department. Mr. Miller has previously appeared before our panel as well. Thank you, too, for your continued support of this subcommittee's oversight. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Sprayberry.
Homeland Security Consortium to evaluate return on investment found that for every grant dollar invested, the median return was $1.70 for state emergency management and Homeland Security agencies. True value. North Carolina can attest to the impact of these federal preparedness grants that have an impact on catalyzing and substantiating our advancements to terrorism preparedness. This funding is utilized to develop local and state capacity for everything from building cyber capacity to funding active shooter exercises. Over the years, the funding awarded in these two grant programs has been significantly reduced. To provide some perspective on the changes and reductions in program support, the state of North Carolina in 2009 received approximately $20 million in the State Homeland Security Grant Program, $5 million of which was used for the Urban Area Security Initiative. In 2019, we received $5.7 million, and our UIC jurisdiction of Charlotte was not funded. I would like to state for the record that the removal of Charlotte, the host of the 2020 Republican National Convention, from the list of funded UIC jurisdictions is problematic. As the state's most populous jurisdiction with a large presence of critical infrastructure to include one of the largest concentrations of financial institutions nationwide, the lack of funding to support the jurisdiction has put our state at significant risk. In a time of ever-increasing threats and risks, this is time for a closer state and local partnership for more significant and faster financial investments, not continued funding fluctuations or reductions. Regarding preparedness grants, I want to note that the Federal Emergency Management Performance Grant, EMPG, is a foundational component of emergency management funding at both the local and state level and is essential to the sustainment of our response and recovery capabilities for all states and territories. We greatly appreciate Congress's demonstration of support in this program with a $5 million increase for FY20, and we're committed to continuing to demonstrate to you the return of this investment. To better support the states in addressing preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation effectively, we would offer the following recommendations. Number one, all hazards grants approach to acknowledge the way states are now organized to address the evolving threat dynamic. Implement a true all hazards approach for grant programs beyond a narrow terrorism focus as threats and hazards evolve in order to allow states to address their known needs. Number two, grant flexibility. Flexibility in state allocation of grant funding, particularly in recovery funds after disasters, to address known strategic needs and not a one-size-fits-all approach across disasters and states. Number three, well-defined risk assessment metrics. Development of a well-defined defensible metrics to determine the risk and threat to metropolitan statistical areas in a process that is transparent and conducted in partnership with the states. Number four, a common application for disaster survivor recovery programs. Implementation of a common application for disaster survivors that can be used across all federal disaster recovery programs to aid in speeding the award of vital funding and support to survivors. And finally, five, faster disaster funding allocation. Increased speed of disaster funding allocation, specifically with CDBG-DR. To date, North Carolina has not received its Hurricane Florence CDBG-DR funding allocation from HUD. On behalf of the state of North Carolina, thank you again for holding this hearing and drawing attention to the needs of the emergency management and homeland security community, working to enhance preparedness for terrorism and other threats to communities. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Kearse to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Payne, Ranking Member King, and members of the committee. The attacks of September 11, 2001 were defining moments in our attitudes towards terrorism. More than a decade and a half later, people can still recall where they initially heard about or saw footage of the Twin Towers collapse. In the wake of this tragedy, the federal government took numerous actions to better prepare our nation for future terrorist attacks. Among those actions were new legislation appropriations that committed to using federal grants to bolster state and local capabilities in defense of terrorism threats and close the gaps in national preparedness not filled practically by the federal government. Two of the most critical grants were the State Homeland Security Grant and the Urban Area Security Initiative. 18 years, both programs remain a testament to their importance. Congressional appropriations to the grant programs have diminished over time, absent information on a return on investment, such as the corresponding contributions invested by the states and local governments. These grants remain an easy target for funding cuts. For example, beginning in fiscal year 2011, the SHSP and the UASI grants were roughly halved over a 2-year period. Without better information about these contributions of states and localities to increasing terrorism preparedness, federal preparedness grants may face further elimination. In 2019, New Jersey received $36,331,372 in Homeland Security grants. Included were $20,050,000 from the Urban Area Security Initiative program to benefit law enforcement terrorism prevention activities in Newark and Jersey City areas, $8 million state Homeland Security grant, and $8.2 emergency management performance grant. The UASI grant for Newark and Jersey City resulted in an 11% decrease from fiscal year 18 funding levels. The total population associated with Jersey City, Newark, UASI is approximately 4,792,594, which equates to more than half of the entire population of the state of New Jersey, making this region one of the most densely populated areas in the United States. In the middle of this section of the New Jersey Turnpike in Union and Essex counties that runs through what the FBI and the government officials from New Jersey have dubbed the most dangerous 2 miles in America. This includes the largest port of the East Coast, Newark Airport, major rail lines, densely populated cities, and chemical and petroleum refineries, all of which create a target-rich environment. Cuts to the federal programs designed to fight terrorism mean that some hard choices are on the horizon. Law enforcement and emergency preparedness professionals are constantly training, planning, and equipping themselves to respond to the threat of terrorism on the communities. They rely heavily on the UASI grants to ensure New Jersey is a safe place to live and work and raise families. Given the wide variety of threats and vulnerabilities that states and major areas face, it is not surprising they have adopted different attitudes towards terrorism preparedness. Moreover, jurisdictions have had to formulate their approaches and make decisions even as our nation's understanding of what constitutes terrorism preparedness has continued to evolve and in the face of corresponding shifts in federal priorities. For a few jurisdictions, terrorism preparedness is a federal responsibility discharged through federal grants. Since 9/11, white supremacists and other far-right extremists have been responsible for almost 3 times as many attacks on U.S. soil as Islamic terrorists, has government reported. From 2009 through 2018, the far right has been responsible for 73% of domestic extremist-related fatalities, according to a 2019 study by the Anti-Defamation League. More than 49 people were murdered by far-right of extremists in the U.S. last year. The horrific act of domestic terrorism, which occurred in my city on December 10, 2019, is a prime example of this statement. At 12:43 hours, the police radios crackled with urgency. In the back of the cemetery, we have a PO shot in the head, down on the ground in a lifeless condition. Responding police units found Detective Joseph Seals laying mortally wounded on the ground. Detective Seals was a highly decorated, well-respected Jersey City police officer. He was a member of a department ceasefire unit, a squad formed in 2013, mainly tasked with investigating non-fatal shootings. On the morning in question, Seals was on the streets of Greenville near Bayview Cemetery. He spotted a U-Haul cargo van, which was the subject of a homicide bolo from a neighboring city. As Detective Seals lay dead in the Jersey City historic Bayview Cemetery, a deadly rampage by the officer's killers was underway just a mile away. A security camera captured the horror as a white U-Haul cargo van pulled up in front of a Catholic elementary school across the street from an Orthodox synagogue and kosher grocery store on Martin Luther King Drive. The driver, David Anderson, clad in a dark trench coat, burst out of the car with an AR-15 style rifle in his right hand. He immediately started firing as he crossed the streets in the pouring rain. His passenger, Francine Goodman, got out carrying a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun and followed him. Without pausing, Anderson fired one round into the Jersey City kosher supermarket to the right of a nondescript synagogue and upstairs yeshiva filled with 60 children. Terrified people on the sidewalk scattered. Some dove for cover, some ran full speed down the street. Anderson and Graham disappeared into the store. Lee Minda Ferenz, a mother of 3, owned the grocery store with her husband, Moish Ferenz. He had left the store briefly to go to the synagogue next door for the afternoon prayer. Douglas Miguel Rodriguez, 47, a store employee, was found near the back entrance, believed to have been shot as he sought to escape. Married with an 11-year-old daughter, he had come to the U.S. from Ecuador 3 years earlier. Moise Sturch, a 23-year-old rabbinical student visiting from Williamsburg, was inside getting a sandwich. In the next few minutes, 2 police officers running to the scene in the Greenville section were shot and wounded. In the more than 3 hours that followed, Martin Luther King Drive between Bidwell and Bayview Avenues turned into a war zone. Hundreds of shots were fired, bullets smacking into the Sacred Heart School on the other side of MLK Drive where children huddled. Police helicopters hovered overhead while SWAT teams took up positions on the rooftops. A Jersey City Police Department Bearcat armored vehicle rumbled into position in the front of the store, detectives firing from inside. The siege finally ended when the armored vehicles occupied by tactically equipped police officers breached the grocery store, engaging both subjects. Only then did the officers find the bodies of 3 victims along with the 2 shooters who were shot dead by police. In their abandoned U-Haul van was a pipe bomb and a note. "I do this because my Creator makes me do this, and I hate who He hates." The horrific event was brought to a conclusion due to the tactical equipment and training provided to law enforcement officers, all of which were funded through the UASI grant. State and local officials are responsible for initiating the critical first response in the U.S. preparedness system, which calls for the lowest possible level of government to manage an emergency. States have very little resources for this on their own. They have relied on the federal government from the beginning. They have essentially been able to stand up their preparedness activities in the last decade on the shoulders of the federal support. Simply put, reduced homeland security funding places our nation at risk. It minimizes our capacity to mitigate, prepare, respond, and recover from hazard events while simultaneously increasing our risk. If we are to continue to prepare for, respond to, and recover from evolving threats and disasters, we will need sufficient resources to sustain and adapt our capabilities. In closing, I wish to extend my sincere thanks for affording me the opportunity to appear before you today.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Masters to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Payne, Ranking Member King, distinguished members of the committee, America's Jewish community is under attack. Thank you for taking action to stop it. I'm Michael Masters, CEO and National Director of the Secure Community Network, or SCN, and it's an honor to appear before you to participate in this hearing. To protect Jewish lives, we are counting on you, the members of the subcommittee, to support the funding desperately needed to prevent further assaults and to train people on what to do in case of an attack. Without you, the faith-based community would be in greater danger. SCN is the official safety and security organization of the Jewish community in North America. We work on behalf of the Jewish Federations of North America and the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. covering 50 national nonprofits, 146 Jewish federations, and over 300 independent communities, representing approximately over 90% of the Jewish population in North America. We're the Jewish community's official liaison with federal law enforcement, particularly the FBI and DHS, and every day we are working to develop best practice safety, security, and policies, undertake threat and vulnerability assessments, conduct life-saving training and exercises, and provide critical incident response. We've worked with Jewish organizations in each of your and every one of your home states. We were in Jersey City after the attack supporting the Jewish Federation, and earlier this week provided training to the community in Monsey, New York. I've personally served in several law enforcement and homeland security roles, a police officer trained in special weapons and tactics, and a commissioned officer in the United States Marine Corps. I previously served as the Chief of Staff of the Chicago Police Department and the Director of the Department of Homeland Security in Cook County, Illinois. My job and that of my team is to secure our communities so that the Jewish community can pray, celebrate, and gather in peace. We're not volunteers or private contractors. We are professionals dedicated specifically to the community. As a security expert informed by personal experience, I can tell you without equivocation that the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, or NSGP, has placed the nonprofit faith-based community in a better position to be safe and secure. That means that more Americans, regardless of faith, can worship and gather in peace. This is critical not just for the faith-based community, but for the very preservation of religious freedom in this nation. The threats facing the Jewish community are both complex and dynamic, and at their core, they derive from an evil that is thousands of years old: anti-Semitism. The Jewish community not only remains the #1 target of religiously motivated hate crimes, but we have seen a rise in these events to near historic levels, as well as increases in anti-Semitic incidents across the nation. As Ranking Member King pointed out, the ideology and motivators for the individuals behind these attacks range across the spectrum. Since the attack in Pittsburgh, law enforcement has disrupted over a dozen plots targeting the Jewish community around the country. The attack 2 weeks ago in Monsey, New York, where the Jewish community gathered to celebrate Hanukkah, was the 13th incident in New York in 3 weeks. The church shooting in Texas less than 18 hours later was the 14th deadly shooting at a house of worship in this nation since June 2015. These events are horrific reminders of why this hearing is so important. NSGP funding has made our communities more safe and secure. It's placed electronic locks on exterior doors of Jewish community centers, cameras on synagogues, and panic buttons in Jewish school classrooms. NSGP funding is now protecting more communities in more places. Recent changes allow organizations in non-urban areas to take advantage of the program. From attacks in Overland Park, Kansas, and Sutherland Springs to Monsey, New York, and White Settlement, as the threat has changed, this has been an important and critical expansion. NSGP provides funding for training that saves lives. Today, NSGP funds can now be used to support planning, exercising, and training for everyday congregants. For organizations that could not support such training prior, this can literally be the difference between life and death. Every day, we work to build relationships between our community and law enforcement, from state, local, and federal, and thanks to the good work of men and women like those to my left and right. The NSGP is a component of this, fostering critical cooperation and engagement. Chairman Payne and Ranking Member King, I'm deeply appreciative for your efforts to increase funds for this program. Last year, with $60 million available, we understand that there was close to $170 million worth of requests. We're pleased that Congress increased the funding to $90 million this year to help bridge this divide. At the same time, we intend to continue to work to make sure more organizations know about these funds and how to effectively apply and use them. We encourage increases to the program to meet the need. From attacks in Pittsburgh and Poway to Jersey City and Monsey, the Jewish way of life in the United States of America is under threat. In each of these attacks, SCN's team was responding. What is required is a whole community response. No one in this country should ever question whether it is safe to walk into a religious institution. And an attack on any religious institution, regardless of size, location, or affiliation, is an attack on all of us as Americans. The NSGP and related efforts have assisted in reducing the threat and providing peace of mind, but there is much more work to do, and as recent events show, we do not have time to lose. Thank you for what you are doing for our community and for the country.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Miller to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Payne and Ranking Member King and members of the committee. We appreciate the opportunity to be here to testify before this committee and to sit with our partners and colleagues Mike, Michael, and Greg, who are valuable partners and incredibly important in this effort. I'm John Miller, just for the record, Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism for the New York City Police Department. On behalf of Police Commissioner Dermot Shea and Mayor Bill de Blasio, I'm pleased to testify before your subcommittee today to discuss the NYPD's counterterrorism and emergency management efforts and the essential role that our federal partnership and DHS grant funding plays in the NYPD's efforts to secure New York City. I want to be clear from the outset. I know that I and other executives of the NYPD charged with keeping the city safe have made this point before here, and we will likely make it again. But our ability to prevent or be adequately prepared in the event that we do not prevent a catastrophic event is dependent in no small part on our successful collaboration with our federal partners and the funding of the federal government that is provided to our city. Funding that, if eliminated, if reduced, or frankly not increased, will result in an erosion of our counter-terror and intelligence capabilities, cessation of many of the initiatives that I'll talk about today, and a significant limitation of our overall emergency preparedness posture. Although New York City enjoys the status of being the safest large city in the nation, we also remain the primary target for violent extremists, both foreign, homegrown, as well as state-sponsored terror networks seeking to use New York City as a pawn in their global terror campaigns. That is not speculation. It is the consensus of the global intelligence community, and it's backed up by empirical data. It's vividly apparent to the entire nation in light of our military's recent action against Qasem Soleimani. Unlike any other city, New York City was required to undertake an immense response to secure itself based on the action our country took in its own defense. Now, that's nothing new. In fact, these nefarious organizations and networks are in a perpetual state of planning to identify targets and vulnerabilities in New York City, particularly in the event their handlers determine attacking our homeland is in their strategic interests. Consequently, the NYPD is in a perpetual state of alert to identify and neutralize not only those seeking to attack our city, but also terrorist scouts that aim to feed intelligence about our city to their managers. 3 such cases come to mind. In 2017 and 2019, sleeper agents working for the terrorist organization Hezbollah were arrested and charged with scouting in New York City. All 3 arrested by the FBI NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force. In each of those cases, among the 120 New York City detectives assigned to the JTTF, they were integral parts of those investigations. All 3 were arrested, and in the most recent case, Alexei Saab was arrested only this past July. One of these suspects looked at government targets in New York City. One of these suspects looked at critical infrastructure in the United States from Lake Michigan all the way down to the Panama Canal to help with plans to disrupt the global economy. Another looked at tourist locations and landmarks. Obviously, considering that Hezbollah is a designated foreign terrorist organization of some degree of sophistication, that's very concerning. Since September 11th, there have been more than 30 terrorist plots emanating from or against New York City, with targets such as Times Square, the Brooklyn Bridge, JFK Airport, the New York City Stock Exchange, the subway system, as well as major synagogues and many other sites. In most cases, these plots have been thwarted by the efforts of the NYPD and the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force with our team there, using traditional law enforcement techniques as well as cutting-edge crime-fighting and counterterrorism technology. Since June alone, we have uncovered and stopped 4 plots at various stages. Last month in Brooklyn, a man who was radicalized online was arrested after pledging allegiance to ISIS and was in the active encrypted pro-ISIS chat room posting bomb-making instructions and calling for attacks in New York City. In September, a Hezbollah operative referenced before, Alexei Saab, was arrested living in New Jersey, charged with terrorism-related crimes after having conducted extensive surveillance on potential bombing and attack targets in the city, such as the UN, the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, our airports and bridges. Specifically, he scouted these locations for structural weaknesses so as to inflict maximum damage and chaos. In August, a Queens man, Awais Chaudhry, was charged with attempting to provide material support for ISIS after having planned a knife attack on the World's Fair Marina Park next to the U.S. Open in Flushing, Queens. He had gone so far as to purchase a tactical knife, a mask, as well as gear to hold his camera so he could film the attack and post it as ISIS propaganda. In June, a different Queens man was arrested for obtaining 2 handguns with obliterated serial numbers to be untraceable so as to carry out an attack on the red steps in Times Square, shooting tourists and New Yorkers as they sat there. Tragically, in recent years, aside from all the attacks we have prevented with our federal partners and using this federal funding, we've had 4 attacks that have succeeded in striking our city. An explosion in Chelsea, a white supremacist who murdered an African-American man with a sword as part of a practice run for a larger racist plot of murders, a terrorist who drove a truck into the West Side Highway running path, killing 8 people after running over 12, an ISIS-inspired suicide bomber who set off a homemade suicide bomb in the Port Authority bus terminal subway beneath the terminal, injuring 3 individuals and himself, only because of technical errors he made in constructing that device. Freshest in our minds, obviously, is the rash of anti-Semitic violence that has taken place in and around New York City and the increasing trend of violent bias crimes of all types we've seen nationwide. Last month, the NYPD Intelligence Bureau formed a new unit, REMI, or the Racially and Ethnically Motivated Extremism Unit, which operates as a quasi-task force consisting of 25 NYPD personnel, detectives, intelligence analysts, working side by side with members of the New York State Police, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and in cooperation with the FBI. REMI is specifically dedicated to investigating and stamping out violent bias crimes in and around the city before they occur. In under a month since its formation, the unit has opened 12 investigations into hate-related groups plotting or planning crimes in and around the New York area.
If you could wrap it up, please.
Excuse me, sir?
So you just wrap it up.
Yeah.
Okay. In our counterterrorism and emergency preparedness posture broadly, we should not merely imply a reactive posture. We can't operate, have not operated, and will not operate from a position that accepts there's nothing we can do to prevent an attack, and instead should merely prepare to respond for the inevitability of it happening. Our Intelligence Bureau entire mission to uncover plots before they become realized and before people get hurt or killed. That's our mission as we see it. Now, to get to the core issue here, the NYPD relies heavily on federal funding to strengthen our counterterrorism, intelligence, and emergency preparedness capabilities, including the security of critical transportation, port infrastructure, and other critical infrastructure. The department has received $1.9 billion in counterterrorism funds via the federal grants since 2002, funding that began after 9/11. While in recent years, the funding has remained relatively stable year to year, the city received $26 million less in 2018 than it did in 2008.
Okay.
So we have seen the funding begin to decline.
And Mr. Miller, I'm going to have to cut you off. We're gone far over the.
Sir, on behalf of New York City, though, can I cede my 5 minutes? Give Mr. Miller the opportunity to finish his testimony. I won't ask any questions.
Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that, Congressman Rose, but I'm happy to include the rest of this information in the answers to your questions.
Okay.
I was
thank you.
suggesting maybe Max Ross has already given up his time, so we wanted to listen to him today.
Well, actually, the 5 minutes is up, so you just used your time.
There we go.
We will now go to questions, and I will start the round. Mr. Kearse, Mr. Sprayberry, in FY 2019, the Jersey City, Newark, Uwasi jurisdiction funding was cut by $2.7 million, and the Charlotte Uwasi jurisdiction was not funded at all in FY 2019. How will the cuts in Uwasi funding impact emergency preparedness in your respective jurisdictions?
I'll go. So, as you know, Charlotte was our UASI, and being cut, they're not going to be able. They had a cybersecurity initiative that was underway that won't be funded. They were in the process of purchasing communications equipment that won't be funded. They were in the process of buying anti-terrorism law enforcement equipment. They won't be able to purchase that. They had some exercises that were planned, active shooter exercises, cybersecurity exercises. They won't be able to do that. A communications training week, one of the things that we know from every exercise or every event that we've ever had, communications is a huge issue, and so we like to concentrate on bettering our communications. So the Charlotte UASI has also been ready to deploy assets, not just within the UASI region, but statewide and nationwide with the assets that they have built. And I just want to reemphasize that they are the home of the 2020 Republican National Convention for us, and we continue to grow. We're the 9th largest state in the nation, so it's having a significant effect. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that concerns me a great deal that the Republican convention is there, and that's a very high risk event, and that does not bode well. Mr. Kearse?
Chairman Payne, I think one of the biggest issues we're dealing with, I'm on the executive board of the Jersey City, Newark UASI. We met on Monday, and these discussions included training is a key to being able to combat this domestic terrorism that we're all facing now. The issues that we see is that with retirements, younger officers coming into play, failure to adequately supply them with the training and the funding necessary for the equipment is critical. The incident that we discussed earlier in Jersey City, and as my colleague John had mentioned, the incident in Muncie, only shows you how critical the need is here. We are all seriously looking to make serious cuts, which I think would undermine our preparedness levels and leave not only our UASI regions, but the whole country vulnerable.
Thank you. Last week's killing of the top Iranian general by U.S. forces prompted the Iranian government to promise revenge. In 2017, Newark's computer system was hacked by 2 Iranians who kept the system shut down until $30,000 ransom was paid. It's possible that Iran could execute similar cyber attacks against the U.S. What investments have your jurisdictions made in cybersecurity using DHS grant funding? Mr. Miller?
We have set up a critical infrastructure committee, as it were, bringing together power, water, banking sectors, cellular communications, all of the systems that are required to work if our response in an emergency preparedness or terrorism situation is to succeed, and started to exchange information with them about known signatures, IP addresses, specific malware, to make sure that the simple fact that a piece of critical infrastructure is not being maintained to the highest level is not going to be the vulnerability that is going to cause systemic failure. Our cyber efforts, our cyber analysts, our director of cyber intelligence operations, people integral to this process, the people who built this process, are all paid for by DHS, Homeland Security, and cyber grants.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kears?
Pretty much echoing what John says, we too were, during the time when Newark was impacted, they tried to impact our communication system. We have taken measures, there again, funded through UASI, to put measures in place that prevented that. And there again, if things are on a cutting block, I think you have to take a holistic look at everything that we are paying for, and obviously put the money towards preparedness and training and equipment. Possibility something like that could fall by the wayside. I don't think that the cities and the states really have the capabilities or the funding to do so without the support of the federal partners.
Thank you. And I'll try to constrain my time. I'll now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, if I could just focus for a moment on Iran and Hezbollah. Obviously, the killing of Soleimani has raised that to a different level. But as you said in your testimony, this goes back many years, the attempt by Iranian sleepers to penetrate New York. How confident are you that you have surveillance and knowledge of the main operatives for Iran and or Hezbollah in New York City or the New York City metropolitan area?
I think between the NYPD Intelligence Bureau and the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, as well as elements of their counterintelligence squads in New York, we have developed a much better picture of the Iranian network on the ground in the United States and in New York in particular, with the recent arrests, identifying if Qasem Soleimani pressed the red button on his desk and said, events have changed to the point that we need to attack on U.S. soil, who would be on the other end of that button? So I think that's a giant step forward. But I harbor no illusions, Congressman King, that with our ability to break up that network of sleeper agents collecting target intelligence, that the government of Iran, its Quds Force, its IRGC, the machine built by Qasem Soleimani, or Hezbollah itself as a critical key surrogate would not seek to, has not sought to rebuild that network in New York and other cities.
And again, for the purpose of this hearing, the federal funding you get is essential to this type of monitoring, right?
It is. Our counterterrorism program is built on that federal funding. And I would make the larger point for my colleagues at the table, if there was any illusion that while New York is in the bullseye of that target, that somehow that kind of terrorism would not visit Jersey City to our west, or Muncie to our north in Rockland County, or what we've seen with extremism in Charlotte, whether it is things that we don't technically call terrorism, but attacks by people like Dylan Roof in a church, in a racist attack, or the ramming attack by a car at a protest. We need to be looking at this in the broadest sense, which is our interest is obviously New York City and our position as a target, but our larger interest is that the Homeland Security grant pie does not shrink, because this is a national problem that we are learning turns up in places across the country. New York depends on those places as well. Many of the plots that targeted New York emanated from outside. We need our partners to be as strong as we are.
Thank you. On the issue of anti-Semitism, I guess it's both Mr. Miller and Mr. Masters, if anybody else wants to join in, it was felt all along, rightly so, that the main threat seemed to come from white nationalism. None of the recent attacks in New York and New Jersey came from white nationalists. And I guess the point I'm making is, are you looking into whether or not this is multifaceted, why there's this increase from so many different quarters? I mean, anti-Semitism was, for the most part, it was latent, it was there, but never the extent it's coming. It seems to be coming from so many different quarters right now. Is it social media? Are there any reasons you can focus on as to what could be causing it? And what steps would law enforcement be taking to see the entire areas from which this type of anti-Semitism can come?
Thank you, sir. So first, I would point out that we have seen rises in anti-Semitism across the country. Certainly the events of the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks in New York are of great concern, and we have the value of the dollars, the value not just of the nonprofit security grant program, but the larger DHS preparedness grants, which creates connectivity with law enforcement, also creates connectivity and information sharing between law enforcement and the faith-based community, so that we know that when we have issues in New York City, that there is direct reaction and proaction from the NYPD and our state and local and federal partners, similarly across the river in New Jersey and around the country. To the substance of the question, the rise, as I pointed out, is across the country, and it is from, as you made the statement, Ranking Member King, in your opening remarks, from a myriad of ideologies and motivators. As my colleague, Mr. Kearse, pointed out, the largest number of extremist attacks in this country where someone was killed that had been undertaken since September 11, 2001, were perpetuated by those affiliated with white supremacists or neo-Nazi ideology. The last several weeks, though, demonstrates the complex and dynamic threat environment we are in, which for the Jewish community means that we need to be prepared for that threat. We need to be prepared for the Islamist extremist threat. One of the cases that Deputy Commissioner Miller mentioned related to 2 Iranian nationals that were observed in the criminal complaint noted that they had been surveilling a Hillel organization on a college campus, which is a Jewish organization at the University of Chicago, as well as a Chabad house in the city of Chicago as well. So we see foreign state, non-state actors, their proxies. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is nearly as old as the faith. And that is a reality that we have to deal with, and means that we have to prepare in a whole community manner, and that's what we're working to do.
If I could just add to Ms. Payne, if I will, you mentioned about, somebody mentioned about the closest of New York and New Jersey. I would say Mr. Payne's district is closer to New York City than most of the New York congressional districts are to New York City, so we're stuck in this together, Don.
Absolutely. I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rose.
Thank you, sir, for being generous after I fell on my sword for Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to New York and the country. $26 million difference between what New York City received in 08 and 18, adjusted for inflation. If it kept on going, New York City would have more than $30 million right now for additional counterterrorism associated spending. So my question for you is twofold. One, under your understanding, who makes the decision to allocate money to New York City? And that's a simple question. Number two, what would you do with that additional money?
We have the advantage of being a $5.6 billion organization, but I would underscore, like many other government agencies, 85% of that cost is personnel. That's 50,000 people that work for the NYPD. That means that smaller percentage when it comes to crime fighting. There's a reason we're the safest big city in America, is what's left for the rest of that investment. That's cars, technologies, and so on. I think it's notable that when you take the theory of this funding, which is after 9/11 there were big numbers because things had to be built out, and the assumption would be that those numbers would get smaller because most of the things have been bought and now it's just an issue of maintaining them. But when it comes to technology, it becomes outmoded. When it comes to vehicles, they need to be replaced. When it comes to a major capital project like the domain awareness system, which started out with 8,000 cameras and that much fiber, is now up to an excess of 20,000 cameras. That makes New York that much safer, that many more license plate readers, that many more data streams that share information with that system and rack and stack it to an inquiry that gives us decision advantage in a crisis. As that system grows, it doesn't get less expensive, it gets more expensive. And the operation and maintenance for a system like that can be in excess of $50 million a year when you consider the cameras, the fiber, the staffing, and so on. So I think if you combine the idea that as our capabilities grow, they cost more.
Sure.
And I think if you add to that the threat is not shrinking. The threat is more complex and more dangerous than it was 20 years ago. The threat has also not narrowed, it has widened. As my colleague just pointed out, We now have white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi groups, Black Hebrew Israelites, Moorish sovereigns.
And to the point
all
on
getting
those,
in the game.
I would just like to quickly get your opinion, Mr. Masters' opinion, ways that we can help you beyond financing. One, domestic terrorism charge. Two, designation of global neo-Nazi organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. How, in the absence of this federal action, how are your actions constrained and hindered?
Right now, if one of our subjects or suspects sends blankets and boots to the Taliban or to ISIS in aid of their fighters as a designated foreign terrorist organization, they're facing up to 15 or 20 years in prison for material support. On the other hand, someone who gives material support to a domestic terrorism group like the Atomwaffen Division or a violent neo-Nazi organization, white supremacist group, sovereign citizen group, you name it, is not facing the same sanctions, the same penalties, the same ability for law enforcement. The domestic terrorism statutes on the federal side are laden with requirements that it needs to involve either a foreign designated group, which doesn't apply to domestic, that it needs to involve weapons of mass destruction, which doesn't apply to an active shooter plot. We need to decide on the federal legislative level whether we're going to draft laws that call a terrorist is a terrorist is a terrorist, and they don't have to be from outside of this country.
And what about the
Have a
FTO
bomb.
list to expand to neo-Nazis?
I'll cede to Mr. Masters, but I think it fits in the same bucket.
So I concur with Mr. Miller's assessment and agree entirely. And thank you for promoting this issue, Congressman. We have seen, from our perspective, the connectivity between white supremacists and neo-Nazi movements domestically and overseas, whether the individuals are fighting or going to fight in Ukraine as foreign terrorist fighters, or they are communicating with other organizations overseas. And I think that underlying behavior is what is critical in recognizing why the designation is important. When we see attacks, whether an individual is in Norway attacking a camp on Utoya Island, or an Atomwaffen member from California attacking a community, or across the United States, and they are looking at the manifestos, they are mirroring the manifestos in language and substance and style, and you see that replicated in the Christchurch attacks and others in New Zealand. There is global connectivity to these movements. The branches of the tree have spread out, which means that we as Americans, as a faith-based community, are under attack not by an individual, but by an ideology and a movement. And the tools that we need in the arsenal, as you have promoted, Congressman, allow law enforcement to protect the country and allow our community to be safe and secure.
Thank you very much. This, for the record, and I'll close out, this is what Al-Qaeda looked like in the 80s and the early 90s, and is 100% our responsibility to act with the domestic terrorism charge and with an FTO designation.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a brand new member, elected in September, right after the announcement by Homeland Security of the UASI grants, in which my hometown, Charlotte, was omitted, I sit here today with some information before me, and I'm not sure who to direct the question to, but maybe to Mr. Sprayberry. Thank you for being here, sir. Thank you for what you do for North Carolina. The paper that I'm looking at in front of me indicates that since 2017, UASI funding has increased from $605 million to $665 million, some increase in each one of those years. I understand that I'm trying to discern what the policy direction is that leads to the allocation methodology that results in Charlotte's grant being eliminated. I see that so none of that money goes to the 16th largest city in America. It appears to me, according to information my staff gathered, that 20 of the 31 cities that receive funding are smaller than Charlotte. So if I'm trying to intuit that there may be a focus on bigger cities, I can't discern that from that. Can you explain to me the risk assessment methodology reform that leads to this? Is it an objective or a subjective methodology that leads to these decisions?
We think it's a bit of both, sir. We know that that Congress expressed their intent to have the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to fund up to 85% of nationwide risk in the UASI program. It was our understanding, based on the risk assessment for last year, that we hit 85% and maybe a couple of decimal points more. But subjectively, when it was briefed to the DHS secretary, the recommendation was that Charlotte would not be funded. We had DHS come down and brief us in Charlotte to try to become more informed. We included the folks from Charlotte as well as from the state, and had a pretty large meeting. We wanted to ascertain just how they reached that decision, and frankly, we couldn't. And we're still waiting on some data to be provided by DHS. We feel like these decisions are not transparent, and they're not done in close partnership with the state, and we need to have a good understanding of just what the data is that they're using to inform their decision-making.
Following that up, and we don't have a department witness here for me to ask, and again, I'm new. I probably could ask the chairman or the ranking member. They could probably eliminate, but I'll do that offline. As long as you're here, Mr. Sprayberry, do you have any insight that, I mean, as was pointed out by the chairman, we have the RNC convention in Charlotte this year, which seems like not the year to eliminate funding for this. But is there some sort of a substitutional thing going on? The notion that the funding, which is substantial, I think, for the event, that somehow substitutes, or that makes it lower priority to fund these things through the UASI grant?
So we were told that the 2020 RNC was not a factor for their decision. And again, we were told that when the briefing, we were on the line, and when the briefing was made to the secretary, they made a recommendation that the Charlotte UASI be dropped, and she concurred with it.
Well, then I'd have to just say, comment on this, that I cannot intuit the reasoning behind this decision. Smaller cities receive funding, Charlotte doesn't. Charlotte has a major event that you might think would substitute, but that's not the reason. It's inexplicable to me. In the less than a minute you have remaining, you made reference to Charlotte or to North Carolina not having received its CDBG-DR allocation, $168 million for Florence from 2018. Can you speak to that briefly in the seconds we have left?
Thank you, sir. And so it's actually more like $300 million for Florence, and we haven't received our allocation from HUD, and I would tell you that not only have we not received it, we haven't received the Federal Register for that. And so we can't actually get the money into our coffers so that we can begin to help disaster victims until the Federal Register is printed, and then we know how we can execute what they call a state action plan. And then once the state action plan is completed, it gets approved by HUD, and then we get the approval to begin to spend money. So I would tell you, you have thousands of disaster survivors from Hurricane Florence that are still waiting on that funding to be dropped into North Carolina's coffers so that we can execute the funding.
Thank you, Mr. Sprayberry. My time having expired, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member, Mr. King, for this very important hearing. And I wish this topic of today's hearing wasn't so timely, but sadly it is. Across our nation, threat levels are increasing. White nationalist domestic terrorism is on the rise. Global terrorism remains a real threat. And in light of President Trump's reckless strike in Iraq, we may even need to worry about cyber attacks or other retaliation from Iran. DHS grants play a critical role in making sure our communities are prepared, but inexplicably, this administration has sought to cut preparedness funding for state and local partners, even as the risk level has increased. Commissioner Miller, thank you for being here. I'm very proud of the work that you do on behalf of our city. Last year, while the administration's budget request sought decreases, I fought alongside my colleagues to ensure increased funding for nonprofit security grants in the appropriations package. Shortly after this package was signed into law last December, including our requested funding, we received a stark reminder of why it is necessary when yet another anti-Semitic attack occurred in the state of New York. Can you discuss the importance of nonprofit security grants for New York City synagogues, mosques, and churches? And in your experience at NYPD, what are some of the most effective measures grant recipients can take with these funds?
Sun Tzu in The Art of War said, "He who protects everything protects nothing." So when you have a counterterrorism force like the CRC, 526 police officers, you have to look at the threat stream literally on a daily basis, sometimes on an hourly basis, and shift those forces around between those forces, the Hercules teams. You've seen them out there, Congressman, with the long guns, high profile, but you can't cover 250 mosques. You can't cover 1,500 synagogues. You can't cover every piece of critical infrastructure. So you have to be strategic. What that means is that locations that are going to be in the threat stream on a regular basis, houses of worship, other critical places, their ability to protect themselves with enhanced security, guarded access, cameras and sensors, that when there is a threat allows them to document that, whether it's pre-operational surveillance or an incident that occurs, those are law enforcement's best friend, and that is the best layer of protection for a citizenry that in New York City is certainly aware of the threat and invested in it. And I believe, Mr. Masters can speak to that with more specificity, but we are entirely supportive of the funding for schools, religious institutions, and other private organizations that find themselves in the crosshairs of the target.
Very well, thank you. Mr. Masters, anti-Semitic events in this country are at near historic levels, and the significant increase of violence and threats of violence against religious institutions, particularly in the Jewish community, have been unnerving. The most recent of which was a mass stabbing at a rabbi's house in New York State. What do you think is driving this trend? In addition to ensuring robust funding for the nonprofit security grant program, what more can Congress do to be helpful in the face of rising anti-Semitism?
Thank you for the question. What is driving the events is a confluence of issues, but at its root is anti-Semitism. But it is effectuated through individuals that range in ideology and motivation, as Mr. Miller and I have referenced, from the white supremacists and neo-Nazis to Islamist extremists, groups, emergent groups like Moorish sovereigns, Black Hebrew Israelite movements, as well as others, simply individuals. We average one mass attack in this country approximately every 2 weeks. And the reality is that our Jewish institutions, schools, camps, houses of worship, community centers, senior centers are targets not just because they're Jewish, but because our community institutions are under attack during these mass events that we see. And that is a reality that we have to address. And how we address that, to go back, if I may, to part of your question to Deputy Commissioner Miller, is working with facilities to undertake threat assessments. That is the first step of the grant, the nonprofit security grant, to make yourself eligible for it. Those assessments need to be meaningful. They allow us to work with law enforcement to establish a baseline of where an institution is. And then we need to use these grants to develop a strategy. A camera, a lock, even window film, in and of itself is not a security strategy. It is part of a program. And now that the funds can be used for planning and for training and infrastructure protection, it allows us to work with community institutions to develop that security strategy cooperatively and coordinative way with law enforcement at all levels. And that is making an incredible difference around our country.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I want to thank you and the men and women that serve under your direction. for the vital service that you provide to our nation. And reviewing the materials prior to today's hearing and listening to the testimony today, it is very apparent that these grants are multifaceted, that we are seeking not only to protect our homeland from terrorist attacks, both domestic and abroad, but then as we continue to break that down, we look at trying to make sure that we are prepared to respond to active shooter situations, that we are prepared to protect our houses of worship, that we are preparing against cyber attacks, that we are responding to natural disasters, that we are collecting intelligence, and that we are deploying cutting-edge technology across our country in the hope to prevent future attacks. I want to talk very briefly about a couple of those things. First, Mr. Sprayberry, I want to talk to you a little bit about your responses to natural disasters. In your written testimony, in the last 4 years, there have been 3 hurricanes and 1 tropical storm that have struck North Carolina. I know that you have talked a little bit about the importance of this type of grant funding to help, one, prepare you to pre-position assets and to be able to quickly respond to that. So can you talk to me just very briefly about the importance of this grant funding has had for your ability to respond to a natural disaster, and particularly in this case, the tropical storms and hurricanes?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that question. And I will tell you that it has played a critical part for us. We have saved over 7,500 individuals during those 4 storms that you were just referencing to. And we did that with not just helicopters, but also with boats, and we did it with training. Now, we didn't purchase all the boats through Homeland Security. We did a lot of that through our state funding, but we used Homeland Security funding for training. As you know, you can't have a good, well-executed response without having a good communications platform. So we have invested heavily with Homeland Security in our 800 megahertz radio system, and that has allowed all of our first responders, no matter what discipline they have, to basically tie into this 800 megahertz program. We call it Viper, and we are able to deploy anywhere in the state for whatever type of disaster and communicate with each other. And we routinely practice this through exercises that are funded with Homeland Security funding. So I can tell you, we have regional response teams for hazardous materials that also go out when we have disasters. These are big items for us because we have a lot of hazmat spills due to the flooding that we have. And so I can tell you that the money that we get for everything from communications to search and rescue has been key for our success in the response.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, let me ask you very briefly to talk a little bit about some of the cutting-edge technology that you have been able to deploy based upon funds received from this grant. You talked briefly about that on page 3 of your written testimony, but I would just ask if you could expand on that very briefly for us.
One aspect of it is the domain awareness system. Another aspect of it is the hardware. But I think if you take a look at recent events, specifically when Jersey City came under fire with 2 gunmen firing hundreds and hundreds of rounds at police, NYPD sent an armada of armored vehicles purchased with Homeland Security monies for just such a terrorist attack to back them up if needed, as well as bomb technicians, robots, and so on. But on the more technical end, if you look at the Muncie attack against the home of the rabbi with the 5 people stabbed, once our Intelligence Bureau people from the NYPD arrived at the scene at Muncie, which is fairly far outside New York City, and began to get data from them, we fed that into the domain awareness system. At 11:02 p.m., a DHS-funded license plate reader on the George Washington Bridge ticked to us that the vehicle wanted for that attack had just entered New York City. I was on the phone to our domain awareness system, Night Watch, and they began real-time monitoring of the systems with that plate as a vehicle alert under the Voyal system. And when it went into the Bronx, it ticked a second license plate reader, and they went right on the division radio and said to the cops in the Bronx, "This car, wanted for multiple stabbings, is headed your way." When it turned around, it ticked that there was a U-turn and it was headed back into the 32nd precinct, and they went on the radio direct to those units, and as I was heading in that direction, police officers came on and said, "We have that car, we're going to stop it." And prior to that, when the suspect had gotten out of the car and gone into a store, his movements were recorded by one of the domain awareness systems cameras that were funded by the same funds. Suffice it to say, these tools are used every single day in crime fighting in New York City. It's one of the reasons we have the lowest crime among major cities. But in the event of a terrorist attack, they become a critical layer of our protection. The technology is every bit as important, and the investment in maintaining that as the bomb-sniffing dogs, the bomb squad equipment, and the armored trucks, we use it all, and it needs to be maintained and refreshed, but it's critical.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, and I'm out of time, but would the panel all agree that these grants have made Americans safer? Would we all agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member, the witnesses for appearing, and I'd also like to thank the staff. I do so because it is said that great people always rise to the occasion, but the greater people make the occasion, and the staff literally helps make these occasions. They're the greater people, so I thank them. I would like to share a thought that is rarely expressed. When these horrible acts occur, Black people cringe because the first thing that comes through their minds is this: was the assailant Black? We really have suffered so much for so long that this issue plagues us. And it's my opinion that regardless of the race of the person, all people who perform these dastardly deeds based on hate have to be condemned. Doesn't matter what your organization is, how you got started. Maybe your intentions were honorable initially, but they're not now. We have to condemn it because it's hate. And those who tolerate hate perpetuate hate. Hate has to be dealt with from the top. The tone and tenor is set at the top. Mr. Deputy Commissioner, do you agree with the premise that the tone and tenor in your organization is set at the top?
I believe that all organizations are in some manner a reflection of their leadership, yes.
Thank you. And I'm confident that not one of you would agree that there were very fine people among the bigots at Charlottesville. I don't believe one of you would agree. If you do agree that there were some fine people, kindly extend a hand into the air. Let the record reflect that not one hand is in the air. No fine people among those neo-Nazis, white supremacists. The tone and tenor is set at the top. The Chief Executive Officer of the United States of America. Fine people. In Charlottesville, where a woman lost her life to hate. We cannot allow ourselves to tolerate hate from any source. We have to have the courage, the intestinal fortitude to stand against it, regardless as to the source. It's ironic that the president is cutting these grants, and some of the acrimony that we're experiencing is exacerbated by his commentary as whole countries in Africa. This commentary at the top sets a tone and tenor that's unacceptable. My hope is that we can change this. Mr. Bishop, I agree with you. Your city ought not have been cut out of this loop. It should not have been. I don't know what I can do to help you, but I will. This is not a partisan issue. Shouldn't happen. Republican National Convention is going there. I want Republicans protected. After all, I have to have someone to argue with. So I want to help. But I want to make this final comment. We have a bill that passed the House, 290 bipartisan support, was on the suspension calendar, 290, 118, 294, 118 against. This bill streamlines the CDBG-DR process so that you don't have to always start at the top and have the money trickle down to various municipalities. It provides those with accounting departments that can handle large sums of money the opportunity to receive some direct funding. It's a very important piece of legislation. It has passed the House. Our challenge now is to get it through the Senate. Bipartisan ought not be held up. So we have a job to do. I respect you and I support your position. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. Let's see here. And now I recognize Mr. Crenshaw's gone. Let me follow up. Also, Mr. Kearse, I've been advised that FEMA lowered New Jersey's risk ranking. Can you discuss the impact of this concerning information?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We recently learned that our risk ranking dropped from 7 to 9. Obviously, with the top 11 UASIs in the United States, this is problematic. One of the things that we were told in a recent conference call is that DHS is not including intelligence gathering information from the FBI and will not be done so until 2021. Another thing that's quite vibrant in New Jersey, we have what they call SARS reports, which is basically special suspicious activity reports, which are funneled through the local police officers on a state, county, and local level. And they're sent down to our regional fusion center down with the state police in the Rock. If those reports are, and obviously they're sent to the FBI, if those reports are not being included in the analysis by DHS, that's problematic in itself. The other thing is how they account for extremist groups that are residing within the UASI region. There again, with not gleaning this information. The other problem that we have too, it appears that they're not collecting information from the bomb data center, which is another good way to determine where we see additional domestic terrorism incidents. And another problem that we saw was that there's an issue with prosecutions only being counted based on the location of the prosecution on the federal level. And I think last and probably the most important is apparently there was no data call done by DHS in 2019. And what data calls do, it allows what we have risk mitigation planners in each one of our 7 UASI counties to share that information. For instance, one of the things that I found quite troubling, they published a list of major events that's impacting our UASI region. Jersey City was listed for 4 events, when in fact, our documentation proves that we have over 260 major events in 2019 that had at least 1,000 people in attendance. I don't know what the answer is. I think that they have to take a serious look at how they're currently rated. These ratings are being analyzed and presented. And there again, my feeling is that if our rating is lowered, there's a potential that they would lower our funding.
Well, thank you, and we'll definitely have to pose that question to FEMA on how they create that criteria, which, I know in North Carolina, sir, with Charlotte being just totally excluded. It just makes no sense that's the case. But these are issues that we want to raise with FEMA, so we thank you for putting them on the record.
Thank you. Commissioner Miller, just for the record, could you give us the total number of NYPD, both civilian and police officers who are involved in counterterrorism intel units, what the total is? They're working every day on this issue.
So the total number of the people who do this full-time in the NYPD for a living every day is around 2,000. When you consider 700 and some odd in intelligence, an equal number, slightly larger in counterterrorism, then the force at the JTTF, then the forces that we task every day from SRG. But I think when you see a crisis like this, we also press a button, and with the advantageous, funded with DHS funding, our smartphones can make 36,000 NYPD officers, counterterrorism officers. That means sending out that license plate, sending out that picture, sending out that alert, and we're prepared to do that on a regular basis.
Okay. Also, I would just add, and I said this to Yvette Clark, who's a good friend, this committee has worked better when it's bipartisan, and I agree with you. I criticize the Trump administration for the grant funds, but this goes back to the start. Even in the last years with the Bush administration, they were cutting Homeland Security funds. On every year of the Obama administration, they were cutting it. I think the problem we have here is administrations look upon this as a budget issue. They look at it as being static. Now, when this committee was formed, when the Department of Homeland Security was formed, we were talking about Islamist terrorism coming from overseas. We didn't anticipate neo-Nazis, white supremacists, black Israelites. We didn't count on massive gun attacks. So all of this is added. Unfortunately, the budgets, also we weren't counting on all of these climate issues, the flooding. So the budget, even if it stays static, is actually being decreased. I certainly concur with Mr. Bishop. It makes no sense in a year when the National Convention is coming to Charlotte, in addition to everything else, to take them off the UASI list. So what they try to do, in fairness to DHS, is work within a budget, but it's a budget that was basically established in 2002 or 2003. And so we're trying to make everything fit into that budget. I think we have to expand the size of the budget. We have to realize that we have now problems we didn't anticipate then. Then it was just Islamist terrorism. Now Iran is much more of an issue, and not just under President Trump. These arrests are going back during the Obama administration of sleeper cells in New York. And again, the shootings are going on, the attacks on churches. That was minimal back in 2001, 2002, and now it's fallen under the jurisdiction of Homeland Security. So I think we should really try to make a bipartisan effort and a region, and not just keep this regional Northeast versus the South or anything else, realize that every area of the country has increased issues, increased problems that come under the scope of Homeland Security, and that we have to find a way to make a bipartisan pressure, not just to fight every year to put the money back in the budget to maintain it, but to increase it and be out front in saying that, because otherwise we're on defense, whether it's Obama or Trump. They send us a budget with massive cuts, and we think we're heroes because we restore the money. Well, the fact is restoring the money is still a cut, and that's the reality. So I think we should get started early on in every budget year and saying that that money has to be increased. This is not the same as, this is just not some green eye shade accounting issue. We're talking about life and death here. And none of us wants to go through another 9/11. None of us wants to go through the massive hurricanes and storms that have hit. Nobody wants another temple shooting. Nobody wants another church attack. And to have all of this going on, and we're just trying to live within the small budget. It is small in comparison to overall, and yet the cost in human life. I mean, now we're very concerned about anti-Semitism because of the last several months and over the last several years. It could be something else coming up. We have to make sure that the police and all of the organizations have the funding they need. And so, again, I'm saying this, being critical of the Trump administration, as I was very critical of the Obama administration and the Bush administration in the last several years. This is not an accounting issue. It's a life and death issue, and we have to face up to it. That I yield back.
Thank you, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. I was critical of the Obama administration too at the time of the cuts, and I don't know how the formulas are made for this, and that's something that we really have to get to the bottom of, how the criteria is subjective or not. The linkage between New York and Jersey City and Newark. I'll give you two examples that I'm not proud of. The original bombing of the World Trade Center in the lower, when they tried to go low, those terrorists were living in Maplewood, New Jersey, until they did that. The Chelsea bomber ended up running to Linden, New Jersey, after he did his bombing. So these areas are so interconnected, and somehow we have to get the department to understand the connectivity of this in order to make sure that the funding stays robust for the entire nation. And with that, I will...
Chairman, yield just one moment?
Yes.
I think Mr. Miller would agree also that when you make these arrests in New York, you get intel that affects the whole country.
So I could not agree more. And I think if you look at the geography of it, the first World Trade Center bomb was built in Jersey City. The 9/11 hijackers did flight training in New Jersey while living in Paterson. The individual who ran over people on the West Side Highway was living in Paterson, New Jersey. The Times Square truck bomber Faisal Shahzad was from Connecticut. The white nationalist groups that are extending in Western New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and other places are all a factor in this. New York City will fight for its share of the pot. I'm sure we'll do fine, but it's not about taking money from Jersey City or Charlotte. It's what you gentlemen just pointed out. Formula aside, the core here is the pot needs to be bigger for the country. The Pittsburgh attack, as you mentioned, and others are telling us that this is an issue that is spreading. Sure, New York is the top target, but there's nowhere, as we are learning, week by week, that is not a target.
Also, without mentioning names, I'm sure you've come up with other cities where there's a real threat from Hezbollah that are far away from New York City.
We have often said, and I said this recently to our briefing prior to the Soleimani incident, our briefing with the Vice President of the United States at police headquarters, that events in places like Iran can change very rapidly over a period of week or 10 days that can change the geopolitical threat picture vis-a-vis a well-funded state actor, and that we have to be prepared to ramp up to that. These are real factors that have just demonstrated themselves beyond theory.
And see the circumstances, that we fortify in New Jersey and New York, these actors are going to look for points of weakness where they can attack. So it's naturally going to permeate the entire nation. With that, Mr. Rose, if you like another. Oh, the gentlelady from Illinois is here. Where you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Payne. As we know, one of the Department of Homeland Security's most important tools for securing community organizations is the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, the NSGP. These grants help first responders, schools, nonprofits, including houses of worship, defend against terror attacks, and these grants are in high demand. And I'm so pleased that we just enacted a significant increase in their funding, in large part thanks to Chairman Thompson's advocacy. Critically, this additional funding is dedicated to suburban and rural communities like mine in Northern Illinois. Communities like mine face a real resource gap in defending against threats of terrorism, and I'm working on legislation to address that. So first to Mr. Masters, Mr. Sprayberry, and Mr. Kears, when it comes to outreach and engagement with suburban and rural communities, what do you think DHS is doing right, and where are potential areas for improvement?
I think broadly the enactment of the increases in funding, thanks to the members of this subcommittee and certainly led by Chairman Payne and Ranking Member King, has been instrumental. And they are providing guidance and technical support to effectuate those grants. We also know that the need far outweighs even the increase. Where things have been strong, I think that we have seen great support from the protective security advisors across the country. That said, we believe that there needs to be enhanced resourcing to DHS to allow for more protective security advisors. They are overtasked and under-resourced.
100%.
I also believe that information sharing, which is often done through a complex network engaging the DHS-funded fusion centers, state, local, and federal law enforcement, is good, but there are ways to vastly improve that. Deputy Commissioner Miller has referred to the domain awareness system. We would do well to have full awareness around our entire domain and learn from the example of the NYPD around the country. And then I would just simply conclude also increasing funding and encouraging DHS to have the resources to enhance work at on the cybersecurity front with state, local, federal entities, and certainly the nonprofit community. This goes directly to the threat with Iran, particularly for the Jewish community. We are dealing with cyber threats every single day around the country, and they know no jurisdictional boundary. And so it is absolutely essential. I'll just conclude by saying we won't know the time and place of the next incident.
That's right.
We often hear the phrase, there's no known direct credible threat. I firmly believe we won't know it until it's walking up the steps of one of our schools, synagogues, mosques, or churches, which means we need to protect the whole homeland and increase the funds, as the other members have said, to do that effectively.
Thank you. Mr. Kears?
I think one of the big things that we have in our UASI group is we cover a broad spectrum. We have the two largest cities, Jersey City and Newark, in the group, as well as 7 contiguous counties, one of which is Morris, which is primarily a rural area. I think the information sharing piece, which is shared across the board by all participants with the UASI group, is critical. You know, we're fighting a terrorist today, domestic terrorism, that operates under the cloak of darkness. They use the World Wide Web, they use Facebook pages and other internet pages. It's extremely, extremely difficult to determine what they're going to do and when they're going to do it. One of the things that John had alluded to before, the ALPR systems, we use them exclusively throughout the state of New Jersey, and it's critical information sharing. And if we were in a situation where we had to cut back, for instance, on storage capabilities or things like that, these are the projects that would be suffering. The cameras are another key. Jersey City has expanded our camera system to over 300 cameras, most of which are inner urban areas as well as critical infrastructure, and that's key in crime fighting. These are the things that we have to ensure stay in place.
Thank you. Mr. Sprayberry?
Yes, ma'am. I would say that we appreciate the additional funding for the nonprofit grants. One of our challenges is to make sure that our outreach is good and thorough. For you just kind of mentioned it about how do we get to all the rural folks.
That's right.
And that's difficult, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not. And so, you know, there's a limited amount of funding, but we want to try to make sure that we're doing that outreach. We have heard some complaints that the turnaround time on these grants is pretty quick, and so for the application. And so I was speaking with Mr. Masters before, and we were talking about we need to let our folks know that we know about when these grants are coming out. And so you've got 11 months and 2 weeks to begin preparation for your application. So those are the kind of things that we need to get out there, because if you think about synagogues and churches out in the hinterlands of the state, you know, they might not be on the radar for understanding that there are grants available for them. So,
And that they qualify.
And that they qualify.
That's right, because a lot of people are aware that there's money and they don't think that it's available to them. They don't know about the protective service advisors. They don't know about the resources that we have funded and put forward to this country to keep our individual communities safe, and folks have no idea.
That's communications, and so that's still one of our challenges, but we're continuing to work. And we typically spend all of our money, but
Sure.
we want to make sure that it's equitably done and that we're addressing the threat per the risk.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you do in each of your jurisdictions and for your organization, sir, for your testimony. We know how critically important these grants are to supporting vulnerable communities and organizations, and I look forward to working with members of this committee to ensure that their security needs are met by proactively addressing the emerging threats. Thank you.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent to insert a statement for the record from the Jewish Federation of North America, without objection. Mr. Rose? Sure.
Ms. Miller, I certainly stand with sentence of my colleagues that this is a bipartisan failure, the absence of increased Homeland Security funding. You can't say you're tough on terrorism and not fund efforts against it, but certainly all other levels of government have to do their part. So I'm wondering if you could take a few minutes and please speak to your thoughts and sentiments regarding the recent bail reform bills passed by the state and how it has potentially affected the NYPD's efforts to counter skyrocketing anti-Semitism and the threat of violent crime, to include terrorism?
The recent bail reform laws passed by the New York State Senate is a legislative package that was passed in the dark of night without any consultation on a meaningful level with prosecutors, judges, police, sheriffs across the state. What it means to us in New York City is that an entire laundry list of serious crimes have become expressly prohibited by law for a judge to remand someone or to set bail. Cynics have long talked about the revolving door of justice. This is no longer cynicism. This has become a reality. Interestingly, no organization has gone further or faster towards criminal justice reform than the NYPD. We have leaned into this by, along with reducing crime, reducing arrests for misdemeanors by 38%, by reducing the number of summonses, by reducing stop and frisk by 92%, while at the same time seizing more guns, not less than before, and reducing crime while reducing enforcement. This was a solution in search of a problem. It is going to make the city less safe, not more safe.
Thank you, sir. In the wake of what has happened recently, we're certainly more aware, or ever more aware, of the cyber threat to New York City and the region at large. Can you confirm for the record that all pieces of critical infrastructure are right now protected from a cyber attack in New York City?
Cyber is a moving target. Every day that we add a layer of protection to critical infrastructure, somewhere a state actor or a cyber criminal is trying to figure out another way in. So I don't know that there will ever be a state of total protection, but I can say that we have, interestingly, based on a model that was developed in Michigan, put together our critical infrastructure components across all sectors, and we have started to share information truly in a real-time basis. When one entity gets threat information, it is passed to all the entities on the theory that they're all a target.
Great. And is there anything else the federal government can do to assist? We're aware that CISA is providing or making access to some grants, obviously pushing down information. What else can we do to help?
I think we're watching the cyber threat expand. We just launched a 4-month study beyond critical infrastructure, which is the cyber threat to national security, the cyber threat to the average Joe and Jane. And what we found was that we lost over $300 million from victims in New York City over the course of 2019 to crimes where we really have to step up to train 36,000 police officers of how to respond to a complex cybercrime when somebody calls the police, training they don't have. We're going to push resources into that, but this is going to be a continuum for many jurisdictions, and we're all going to need help. We're going to need help on the big side and the small side.
Max, yield for 1 second. Yeah, I would just concur with Mr. Rose as far as Nassau and Suffolk also being very concerned about the bail reform. We are facing real consequences already.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop?
I did have one further question, but before I raise that question and questions to Mr. Miller, I'd be a bit concerned as well about the bail reform and us using extremes. There are individuals based on their economics who have been detained but have not been charged for several years, and it's only because of their inability to pay their bail that they were ultimately held there. We've had some very tragic outcomes as a result of that. And I do believe there should be consultation, but I don't believe that we should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I definitely believe that judges should have discretion, and there needs to be some more tinkering with this, but there have been some very unjust outcomes based on an antiquated bail system that we've had in the city of New York. Having said that, I want to get back to you, Mr. Miller, because I know that in addition to religious institutions, one of the most at-risk targets in New York City is our public transportation network, which we know has historically been the target of international plots. Can you discuss your experience with DHS Transit Security Grant Program, and are there any specific transit security projects NYPD feels should be funded under this program which haven't been?
Madam Congressman, just for the record, the NYPD supports criminal justice reform in the legislative package and bail reform specifically, but it needs to be balanced between all the parts of the criminal justice system, which we feel it was not. But we agree with you on that. On transit security, as you know, we have an immense transit system. It moves about 6 million people a day. And while it also enjoys low levels of crime, we have seen a sustained interest on the part of international terrorist groups in hitting transit as a key part of critical infrastructure. Our last terrorist attack was a man who blew himself up in what he determined correctly was the busiest pedestrian tunnel in the subway system before the Christmas season, and he did that for a reason. We do receive federal funding for our transit counterterrorism teams, for our random bag checks and our scanning for explosives and chemical, but it is again our concern is that as that funding starts to get smaller slowly, and as that equipment needs refresh and replace, that we continue to focus on that because it remains a top target.
Is there something that you think that can be done that we haven't done already in terms of these grants? I talked specifically about New York City, but transit is ubiquitous across this nation. Mobility is something that we all strive for, and we're in a metropolitan area where we're all interconnected. So one disruption in one area means, a shutdown in others. Is there something that we have not looked at that you think we need to take a look at?
We have looked at aspects and spent federal money on things like chemical and biological studies, including how would an agent like anthrax or another biological agent move through the system, given the tunnels and the trains and the winds and so on. We need to look at that further because the preliminary results open additional questions. We need to look at radiation detection because beyond the bullets and bombs, there is the dirty agent or distribution device possibility. Transit covers the myriad of threats. I couldn't give you a list right now today about the projects that we have on hold because of funding, but I can get it for you and respond in writing.
Very well. We will look forward to that. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony here today, gentlemen, and your expertise and service to our nation.
And the gentlelady might know that 2 Congresses ago, Mr. Rose's predecessor and I did a surface transportation committee hearing, and it is really a critical piece that we need to stay vigilant on. Absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Pursuant to the committee rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days without objection. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned. All right, I was going to get us out here by noon. All right, thank you.